Imagine walking up to the lake you've fished at since you were a kid, only to find a 10-foot metal fence, a keypad lock, and a smug HOA president telling you it's no longer yours to enjoy. That's what happened to me. The HOA built a gated community and claimed the lake like they owned it, blocking everyone out but themselves. But what they didn't know, there was only one legal entrance to that shoreline, and it was sitting on a tiny forgotten lot just outside their reach, so I bought it. Cash, and with it, the gate, the access, the only key. They tried to sue, they tried to threaten, but now, they're the ones locked out while I rent the cabin on my land and let the public enjoy the lake they tried to steal. Sometimes the best way to beat the age is to own the ground they walk on. The lake had always been more than just water. To MIT was a sanctuary, a memory preserved in ripples and breeze, a place where time slowed and life made sense, where I'd sat beside my grandfather as a boy, watching his weathered hands teach me how to cast a line with patience instead of force, and where I later brought my own son to continue the tradition, surrounded by the same whispering pines and soft-spoken waves, until the day I returned with my fishing pole and tackle box in hand to find a tall silver metal fence where my path used to be, a heavy gate with a blinking keypad, and a smug little sign that read private property, Lakeside Haven, HOA members only, which immediately struck me like a slap to the past. I stood there blinking, jaw tightening, trying to make sense of how a lake that had always been part of the town's heart could suddenly be taken hostage by a group of newcomers with manicured lawns and color-coded trash bins. And it only got worse when a man in pastel golf clothes, sunglasses, and an attitude the size of Texas stepped out of a shiny black SUV and walked toward me like he owned the dirt I was standing on. Introduced himself as Brent Holloway, HOA, president of Lakeside Haven Estates, and told me with an oily grin that I was technically trespassing because the south entrance to the lake was now exclusive to des-paying members of our neighborhood. And when I asked him how they could possibly claim ownership of a public body of water that had been accessible for generations, he tapped the sign with his knuckle and said, "You can still enjoy the lake, just not from our shore." And with that, he turned and walked back to his car, leaving me staring at the cold, soulless fence that had cut off a part of my childhood. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat up scrolling through property records, zoning laws, land surveys, anything I could find about that damn shoreline, and the smug homeowners who thought fencing off the wild meant they'd tamed it. And after hours of digging, I finally found something interesting. The HOA had purchased a long stretch of the south shoreline and constructed a walking path, but there was only one legal access route into that entire side, a narrow dirt drive that passed through a plot of private land, a forgotten lot with an old, leaning cabin and overgrown brambles, owned by a woman named Lillian Hall, and it just so happened to be listed for sale in a corner of a local real estate site that hadn't been updated in months, which meant the HOA hadn't grabbed it yet. And I wasted no time. I called the number, met with Lillian the next day, and when she opened the door to the sagging porch and looked me over with tired eyes, she said, "Let me guess they sent you to lowball me again." And I told her no, I wasn't with the HOA, I was their problem. And she laughed, really laughed like she hadn't in a long time, and poured us sweet tea while she told me about how they'd harassed her for months, trying to bully her into selling so they could build a fancy gatehouse or some community event space, and how they'd even parked a landscaping truck in front of her driveway just to intimidate her during showings. And I told her I'd pay full asking price in cash today if she was willing. And without even blinking, she said, "Sold." And that's how I became the legal owner of the only access point to the HOA's precious gated lakefront, a $10,000 cabin with a key roll and a $100,000 headache for Brent and his board. The next day I filed the paperwork and removed the HOA installed keycard reader from my gatepost. Yes, they'd run their access system through Lillian's property without permission. Assuming they'd eventually own ITAND, I replaced it with a 12-foot steel privacy fence, cameras, motion lights, and a sign of my own that read, "Private property, no HOA access beyond this point." And within 48 hours, the fireworks began. Brent stormed down the gravel drive with 2 other board members, red-faced and puffing, like someone had just kicked over their castle, demanding I remove the barrier immediately and claiming the HOA had a verbal agreement with Lillian, to which I replied, "That's funny, I have a written one with the county, and a deed, with my name on it." And when he threatened to sue, I invited him to try, and told him I'd enjoy the counterclaim. Over the next few weeks, they sent increasingly desperate letters from a lawyer who clearly had no idea the land had been zoned as rural private decades ago, which made their claims about community right-of-way legally meaningless. And, while they fumbled around trying to figure out how to undo their mistake, I got busy cleaning up the cabin and restoring it into a rustic retreat. Not to live in, but to make a point, because this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about standing up to people who thought they could by nature and bully everyone else out of it. And when I listed the cabin as a lakeside rental on Airbnb, with a tagline that read, "The only shoreline access on the lake, no HOA required," the bookings started rolling in, and suddenly strangers were barbecuing, swimming, and fishing on the shore, right outside their $1 million backyards. And the HOA lost its mind. They tried to get the county to revoke my rental permit, but my zoning was rock solid. They tried to accuse my guests of trespassing, but the sheriff told them flat out, the land was private and the lake was public. And the real kicker came when one of the HOA members, a software guy who thought he could sweet talk his way through anything, offered to buy the land from me for double what I paid, and when I refused, he muttered something about people like me ruining property values, which was rich coming from someone who bought into a fake gated community that fenced off nature like it was a private theme park. The local news caught wind of the story next, running a segment called Locked Out of the Lake that painted the HOA as elitist and out of touch, while framing me as a stubborn underdog protecting public access from private overreach. And suddenly, I had Allentown residents, local fishermen, hikers, and environmental groups all reached out in support, and petitions began circulating demanding that the county step in and prevent future HOAs from cutting off community access to public landmarks. Meanwhile, inside Lakeside Haven, chaos was brewing. Residents were furious that their exclusive lake access now required them to either kayak from the public boat ramp 2 miles away or stare longingly through the fence as tourists enjoyed what they were promised would be private. And at the next HOA meeting, Brent barely made it through his agenda before people started shouting questions, demanding answers, and calling for a vote to remove the board entirely. And while all this unfolded, I watched from my porch with a cold drink in hand, fishing rod beside me, the lake stretching out in front like it always had, free and shimmering, under the open sky, and I realized something beautiful. Sometimes the best way to fight fences is not to tear them down, but to own the only gate and choose who walks through it. And I wasn't done yet, because Brent had one last card to play, and I already had the move planned to flip his world upside down. It was strange how quickly power shifted when people realized the gates they once controlled now stood locked behind someone else's lock, and stranger still how quiet Lakeside Haven became after the initial storm of threats, letters, and hollow lawsuits that couldn't touch the truth printed in black ink on my land deed. But I knew Brent Holloway wasn't done yet, not the kind of man to accept a loss, especially when that loss was public, humiliating, and broadcast across the community as a modern-day David versus Goliath tale, with him cast as the overreaching tyrant and me as the rugged underdog, with nothing but a fishing rod and a legal mask. Even as I relished the quiet satisfaction of watching their lake dreams dry up like footprints on a hot dock, I knew there was one more play to come, and it didn't take long before the HOA shifted its strategy from outrage to desperation. Starting with a public community unity proposal they emailed out to all members, positioning themselves as the victims of an unfair transaction, painting me as an opportunist who exploited a loophole and suggesting I sell them back the land at a fair market price to restore balance to our neighborhood ecosystem, which was hilarious considering how they'd fenced off a publicly loved lake like a private zoo enclosure and told everyone else to buzz off. When the proposal failed mostly because residents were too angry with Brent to trust him with a lemonade stand, let alone a land purchase, the board tried a new angle. They proposed a special assessment, raising HOA dues to form a fund that would purchase my land at any cost. And that's when I knew I'd truly won, because the residents revolted. Dozens of them emailed me privately, some with apologies, others with curiosity, and a few with offers to invest in the cabin if I'd consider expanding the retreat experience. And while I wasn't ready to turn my lakeside land into a tourist resort, I did begin construction on a proper dock and fire pit, improving the guest experience and leaning into the rustic charm that was drawing weekenders from hours away. And it drove the HOA Modesto, especially Brent, who appeared one afternoon, pacing just beyond the boundary of my fence, arms crossed, watching as I guided a family of 4 toward the lake with their rented kayaks and camp chairs in tow, and I couldn't help but tip my cap at him. Because if I'd learned anything through this absurd HOA war, it was that the best revenge wasn't shouting or lawsuits, it was success, peace, and the ability to say no with a smile. The following week, things got even more interesting when a local environmental nonprofit caught wind of the HOA's attempt to privatize access to a public lake, and they launched a campaign to protect the shoreline, arguing that communities should never be allowed to fence off natural resources for the benefit of a few at the expense of the many. And while the HOA tried to argue that they hadn't blocked access, the media wasn't buying it. The photos told the truth. A tall metal fence snaking around the lake like a fortress wall, padlocked gates, and security cameras glaring at would-be visitors, and now that the only access was through my lot, that ugly truth was impossible to ignore. Reporters came out, took photos of my gate, quaint, wood-paneled, handcrafted with a plaque that read Gatekeeper's Retreat, and wrote glowing stories about how one man protected the public's access from corporate encroachment disguised as suburban planning, and I even got a call from a regional travel magazine asking to feature my cabin in their Hidden Getaways issue, which I happily accepted. Meanwhile, inside Lakeside Haven, chaos boiled over. Residents began circulating a petition to remove Brent from the board entirely, citing misuse of funds, failure to deliver on promised lake access, and general incompetence. And the petition gained enough traction that Brent, finally seeing the writing on the wall, resigned at the next HOA meeting in a huff, slamming his binder shut and storming out mid-sentence while a smattering of sarcastic applause followed him to the exit. A new board was elected, one far less confrontational and much more humble, and to their credit, they reached out to me not with threats but with a request for a meeting to explore mutual benefit. And while I was hesitant at first, I agreed, mostly out of curiosity, and I met with the newly elected HOA president, a woman named Sandra Greer, at the edge of my property, both of us seated on old lawn chairs overlooking the lake, the fence between our lands now more symbolic than it had ever been, and Sandra, unlike Brent, came prepared to listen instead of lecture. She acknowledged the mistakes made, apologized on behalf of the community, and asked if I'd be open to granting limited access to residents for special events or holiday weekends. Not mandatory, not purchased, but mutually agreed upon, and scheduled in a way that wouldn't interfere with my rentals. And I thought about it for a long minute before replying that I might consider it under one condition: that the HOA publicly renounce their claim to exclusive shoreline rights and post a notice to every member clarifying that the lake was public and that their previous statements were incorrect, manipulative, and unlawful. And to her credit, she didn't hesitate. Within the week, every Lakeside Haven homeowner received an official notice, signed by the new board, explaining the reality of the lake's status and apologizing for prior misinformation, and the private lake access signs came down one by one, replaced not with anything new, but with nothing at all, because sometimes the best thing you can do to heal the land is to leave it alone. And so, with the fire gone and the war won, life settled into something peaceful again, more peaceful than I'd imagined possible when I first saw that hateful fence. And now I could stand on my dock in the early morning fog, cast my line, and know that the water beyond belonged not just to me, but to anyone who respected it, loved it, and didn't try to put up a gate to keep others out. I still ran the cabin, still welcomed guests with open arms and a smile, and many of them came back, became friends, and told me how rare it was to find a place untouched by resort chains and HOA regulations and the endless noise of property politics. And I just nodded, because I knew the truth: the best parts of life were the ones you had to defend, protect, and sometimes outwit a smug suburban tyrant to preserve. And one day, nearly a year after the whole thing began, as I was stacking firewood beside the cabin, I heard a voice call out from beyond the gate, and when I looked up, there stood Brent, not in his usual smug uniform of pastels and designer shades, but in jeans and a plain hoodie, hands in his pockets, eyes a little heavier than before. And he asked if he could speak, and I said sure, why not? It was a free lake, after all. We sat on opposite sides of the fence for a long time, mostly in silence, and finally he said, I just wanted to say, I thought I was doing what was best for the neighborhood, but I didn't see how wrong it was to take something that never belonged to us. And I nodded, appreciating the honesty, and told him, you don't need to apologize to me, you need to apologize to the lake. And he actually smiled, sad and small, but real, and he left without asking for access, without demanding anything. And I think that was the closest thing to peace he'd ever know. Months later, I got a letter in the mail handwritten from one of the oldest residents of Lakeside Haven, a woman named Ruth, who had watched the whole saga unfold from her living room window. And in her letter she wrote, thank you for reminding us that community isn't built behind fences. It's built around fire pits, with shared stories and open skies. And that letter now sits framed inside the cabin, above the fireplace, next to a photo of me and my grandfather fishing on that very same lake decades ago, before the fences, before the HOA, before the fight. And it reminds me every day that the land remembers who truly belongs, not the loudest, not the wealthiest, but the ones who treat it with care, who listen to the wind, and who stand their ground when someone tries to take the wild and tame it with metal and locks. In the end, I didn't just win a battle over property, I preserved a legacy, protected a freedom, and became the man with the key to the gate, not to keep people out, but to keep the spirit of the lake alive, untamed and shimmering beneath a sky that no fence could ever reach.